Good afternoon, friends. Good to see you again. I wanted to check in. I've been thinking about something I wanted to share with you that has to do with the loss of infants. Sometimes that's a miscarriage, sometimes it's during childbirth, and sometimes it's a neonatal death, which would happen right after the child is born. And the reason I want to talk to you about this is because there's some misperceptions about the intensity of that loss and how it might compare to others. And I know about this because it happened to me. As many of you probably know, I have three children who've passed. And the first one was an infant son. The second one was my daughter, who passed when she was 14 from leukemia. And the third one was my youngest son, who passed from suicide when he was 30, almost 31. So I just want to take you into that experience for me for a minute, without getting into too many details. But I'd already had one child, and about a year after he was born, I was preparing to have what my doctor called a trial labor because my son was born by cesarean section. So I was going to have a trial labor. She didn't see any reason that might not be okay. And I was in a private hospital. I was overseas. I'd had a really good experience in a teaching hospital in Sydney. But the second child was born in a private hospital that did not have emergency services readily available. So it was about 6 in the morning, and I was sort of really getting into the intense part of labor. And all of a sudden, things just started to go south. My doctor was on her way in because she knew that I'd been struggling for a while. And I think the nurse had told her that I might possibly need intervention. So as the labor progressed, I probably should have had a C-section, and things might have gone differently, but because that wasn't immediately available, owing to the fact that it was such a small hospital, um, I had to have a forceps delivery, and my body was just not cooperating, and the baby could not make it through the birth canal, and the umbilical cord was cutting off his oxygen, and unfortunately, he passed away. They were not able to resuscitate him. Now, an interesting thing happened after that. You know, it was all kinds of horrible and awful on so many levels. I mean, physically, it was excruciating. And of course, mentally and emotionally, it was really, really hard because I had a sense that he was probably dying. So what happened was they just whisked the baby away. I never saw the baby. I never held the baby. And they wanted to sedate me, which I didn't want them to do because I just knew that in the morning I would, whenever I woke up, I was gonna have to deal with all that the horrible thoughts of what happened. And I so I didn't accept any sedation at all. Eventually, I went to sleep. But what I experienced during that event and after, um, it was the first loss of a child, so I had nothing to compare it to, but it was an extremely deep sadness and a feeling of emptiness. And you can imagine, I'd gone into the hospital. I'd been carrying this child for 9 months, perfectly healthy. And by the way, the baby was perfectly healthy. There was nothing wrong with him. We named him Shane. And it was just as if a part of me had been ripped out, and it was just this big, huge hole in my heart, but kind of a vacancy in my whole spirit. And I mourned that baby, but I also did all the things that I now know are not helpful when you've had a loss. You know, I did literally replace the loss because 12 weeks later I got pregnant with um another child, and he was a son. He's now living abroad, and I knew from the very beginning that he was the soul of the same child. And magic story, I will tell you at another time, of how I came to find out that that was true. Um, so, you know, I went along for many years. Shane was born again, and I had already had my one son, my firstborn, and it was, I just put it behind me. I was able to kind of compartmentalize it, and of course, everyone tells you this myth that time heals everything, and it doesn't. The intensity might be lost. It might, you know, minimize over time, but the true impact of the loss never goes away. So this is about how long I can tell you it lasted without until I really started healing. I was sitting, that happened in 1976, and in 2008, I was sitting in a class on death and dying at college, and someone brought up the idea about miscarriages and whatnot, and they were minimizing it. The whole conversation was about minimizing it, and I don't know where it came from, but clearly this had not been healed in me, and it just all came out in a flood. I just was crying, and I don't do that typically in front of people, and then rarely even on my own, but it all came out like it had just been buried for so long. And I said, you have no idea what an intense loss this is, especially for a mother, because we're so physically attached, obviously, to that little infant. But that pain really never goes away. And, I think I got all their attention there. I don't ever like to compare losses, but I would say that, each of my three losses were very intense and deep in their own way for different reasons. That the loss of my son was this huge sense of hollowness. The loss of my daughter, I had to deal with the fact that she was in my life every day, and deal with all those all those habits, and the way I woke up with her every day and how she was in our lives. That was a big change. And then, of course, when my son died, because he died by taking his own life, there was a whole other set of circumstances around that. So they're all different, but they all still have their own deep intensity. And so the last piece of this puzzle was when it was just this year, a few months ago, my youngest sister, who was a nurse, didn't really know the details of how I'd lost my son, and she asked me about it, and I told her, and I told her how the nurse and the doctor I never had any closure. They had just taken the baby away, and she knew what kind of delivery it was. And she looked at me and she said, with the kindest heart, she said, they really did you a favor by not showing you the baby, because it was a forceps delivery. And it would have been just horrible for you to see, because that's a very traumatic. It's traumatic for the mother, but it's even more traumatic for that little baby, because they're trying so hard to get the baby out of the birth canal. And so, although I'd never really held any judgment or anger against the nurse and the doctor, I did kind of feel it was a little heartless for them not to let me even hold my baby. And so it was really only this year. It's 2025. That was in 1976. So this is how long you can hang on to the pain involved in these things. And it was such a gift for my sister to share that with me. So I just wanted to tell you about this. It's a story I don't really share very often, but it's not just about me. I really want you to know, in case you encounter people in your life who've had a miscarriage or multiple miscarriages, or maybe a child who has died right after birth or maybe during the birth. It is a huge, painful, emotionally painful event. And the best thing you can do is simply listen to them, provide empathy, but most of all, allow them to tell their story, because it would be different for every single person. So I just wanted to share that with you. Anyone who's had a painful loss, whether it's a child or a loved one of any kind in your life, knows that listening and empathy and not making an assessment or analyzing things is the most appropriate thing to do. Thanks so much, and I will see you again. Bye.